Doug Macgregor sounds very European to me. Americans have a way of war in which we demand unconditional surrender by the enemy and then propose to engage in the enemy's moral reconstruction.
The Europeans who have become accustomed to working with us and for us and aligning themselves with us have to take a very hard look at this business. The United States is in a position from which it cannot easily retreat. As the ambassador pointed out earlier.
Just in line of those observations, I think in terms of the Polish government, the problem is the uncompromising view in a way is Victoria Nuland on steroids in a sense, because the message coming from both the presidential palace and the government and the prime minister is that Russia has to be completely defeated, an uncompromising total defeat. And the way they're framing the situation is that if Russia is not defeated, that would mean the end of European civilization, the end of the liberal West, and so on and so on. How they arrive at that conclusion is anyone's guess, but these are things not even, Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken, Victoria Nuland are saying, and in essence, these are the people that Poland is hinging our foreign policy directives on. I mean, those three people, basically, unless we, believe in the fact or non-fact rather that President Biden has a firm hold on his foreign policy and his foreign policy team. So, the sort of the strategic implications of what's been going on since February 2022 is the Americans say one thing and the Poles take it to the next level in a way. So we're sort of like the Rottweiler, the American Rottweiler here in Eastern Europe, being pulled back sometimes by the Americans, as was the case in the first couple of weeks when we proposed to give those MiG-29s to Ukraine. But, Anthony Blinken even stepped in and said, wait, that's going a little bit too far. We don't want World War III here. Now they're openly talking about it. So I don't know whether we're having an influence, but it's definitely a negative influence, or the tendency is such that, you radicalize over time. But in light of the speech that President Biden delivered last night in Poland, he continues to mention the world. The world is united against this aggression. Now, obviously, he seems to forget that the world also includes China, the Middle East, India. Ambassador Freeman, I'd like to pose this question again to you. China and the Middle East have been positioning themselves, or there's this expectation that they might be mediators in a peace proposal. Anthony Blinken was in Egypt a few weeks ago. They discussed the potential for restarting nuclear arms agreements with the Russians. We have the Russian response already. Actually, we got one yesterday. President Putin has suspended Russian participation in the START treaty. What do you think the Middle East countries and China can bring to the negotiating table and potentially resolving this war as soon as possible? Doug, can Xi Jinping make a successful intervention here?
I think under normal circumstances, he certainly could. Of course, I'm one of these people that tires of hearing people talk about the Communist Party, because there aren't very many communists that I'm aware of still in China. The place could be described in many other ways. But I think it's important for people to understand that China's interest is not in waging war. It never has been. It isn't now. Whatever we don't like about the Chinese are very clear about their principal interest. That's business. And they want to build prosperity. To build prosperity, to do business, you need stability and peace in Central Asia, and that includes Ukraine. If you're going to make the One Belt, One Road work and do business with Europe, you've got to have uninterrupted lines of communication between Europe and China. I mean, that's Ambassador Freeman pointed to the nature of the landscape, and he's absolutely right. I mean, from the rail standpoint, even if you're going to use airships to move across that continent, is an extraordinary achievement if you can do it without warfare. The last time the world saw anything like that was under the Mongolian Empire. The Mongols controlled it. They imposed discipline, and prosperity thrived, frankly. Mongols don't usually get credit for that sort of thing, but it nevertheless is true. So my point is, I think we should listen. But we're not very good at listening right now. We tend to see the world as black and white. We have these ideological blinders on that essentially compel us to condemn everyone who does not readily submit to our will, who doesn't want to be part of a system that we obviously dominate thanks to our financial control of the globe. And we're already beginning to witness de-dollarization. We're watching the BRICS do that. The world is changing. It is multipolar. We seem to want to freeze this. In contrast to Ambassador Freeman, I'm afraid a lot of people in Washington would welcome the DMZ outcome, because that would justify policies and expenditures and behavior that are completely unnecessary under normal circumstances. So if you turn around and say, well, there's no reason to go to war, you're going to make a lot of people very unhappy in the United States. And the other thing is, on this war topic, it seems to me that a lot of people in Europe now, as well as in the United States, have lost any sort of understanding of what the word means. They think it's something that happens on somebody else's soil, that nothing will touch them. That's not true. And they don't understand the Russian capacity to escalate horizontally. But again, we have to get people back to diplomacy. That means mutual respect, honoring interests. If you can honor other people's strategic interests, respect them, work towards mutual prosperity, then you get treaties, then you get trade arrangements, you get peace. We're nowhere near that at this point. And I don't think we're going to get there with leadership.
Doug Macgregor sounds very European to me. Americans have a way of war in which we demand unconditional surrender by the enemy and then propose to engage in the enemy's moral reconstruction. This was the pattern in our Civil War. It was what we tried to do in World War I. It was what we did in World War II. And it was arguably what we did during the Cold War. But most wars end in a negotiation in which whatever's been achieved on the battlefield is reconciled between the two parties. And I think Doug is absolutely right. We don't understand that adequately. Nobody has put forward clear war termination strategy. Nobody's even talking about it. It's, we got to go until President Zelensky can swim on the beaches in the Crimea again, as he said he would. We need to, I agree, we need to listen, we need to think, we need to understand that war creates realities that then require acknowledgement rather than rejection. So we need to be setting the basis for a negotiated resolution of this, with which everybody's going to be unhappy, because nobody's going to get everything they want or even very much of it. But if the war goes on indefinitely, go back to Doug Macgregor's mention about transport across Eurasia. Poland is isolated. That DMZ, if that's what happens, is going to represent a perpetual threat to Poland. So what is now a historical memory of threat could become real again. And I think that would be catastrophic for Europe, for the world. And we ought to be thinking more broadly about how to end this war so that isn't what happens.
That is
Can I say one thing?
Go ahead, Doug.
In connection with that, the Europeans who have become accustomed to working with us and for us and aligning themselves with us have to take a very hard look at this business. The United States is in a position from which it cannot easily retreat. As the ambassador pointed out earlier, our presidents and the leaders here have made, in my judgment, a lot of outrageous demands and comments. They have insisted on conditions that will never be met. It puts us in a position where how could we possibly reach out to the Russians and lead talks and reach any sort of amicable solution? The Europeans can do that. They may have to change some of their leaders that they've currently got, but it's time for the Europeans, especially the Germans and the French. They're not the only ones. I hope people in Poland will start to think about this. Certainly the Swedes and the Danes are beginning to think about it. The Italians have, and the Austrians must. Everyone needs to think about their interests as Europeans. What is in the interest of the European peoples? It certainly isn't an endless war. It is not some sort of arrangement that transforms Russia into the permanent enemy of, quote unquote, the West. Far from it. In fact, we would like to do business with the West. That's my impression of most Europeans. So we've got to get this thing over with. They're going to have to take this whole business and run it. They're going to have to stand up and say, thank you very much, Washington. We appreciate your interests, but those are not our interests. Our interests are in peace, and we're willing to sit down and hammer out a solution. Now, we're a ways from that, but I wonder, once eastern Ukraine is completely under Russian control, if that's not going to sober people up. And if it doesn't, I imagine Russian forces approaching the outskirts of Lviv will. Because let's be very clear. The Russians regard what happens in Ukraine as an existential matter for them. They're not going to stop halfway and say, fine, that's it. That's all we need today. We're going home. They're going to insist that the threat in Ukraine be removed. That can be removed very easily. That it is not the Ukrainian people. And this regime in Kiev is not necessarily representative of what Ukrainians everywhere want. So I think it can be done. The Poles have a role to play in that, but not as our proxy. They have to play a Polish role within the broader European framework.